The great hall of Ashbourne Manor tasted of cold beeswax and the cloying, suffocating scent of lilies. It was a room designed for the proclamation of power, its vaulted ceilings draped in the shadows of ancestors who had ruled the county with iron-willed precision for 3 centuries. Today, however, the air held only the stale dampness of a tomb. Black crape had been wound around the banisters with a funereal tightness that mirrored the tension in the chest of Isabel Thorne. She stood at the edge of the mahogany pulpit, her hands clasped before her, her spine a straight line of ebony against the grey morning light, her fingers, perpetually stained with the faint blue-black evidence of a decade of stewardship, were motionless. To the casual observer, she was merely a secretary, a piece of domestic furniture that had outlived its primary function, now that Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Ashbourne, was, for all intents and purposes, gone from the world. She did not look at the mourners. She did not seek out the sympathetic gazes of the staff. Instead, Isabel watched the rhythmic flickering of the tall candles, counting the seconds between each flare of the wick as a method of maintaining her internal order. The memorial service was a social necessity before the probate court could officially dismantle the life the Duke had built. In the front row sat Silas Vane, the Duke's nephew, his black coat tailored with a precision that his bank account could no longer justify. Silas did not weep. He sat with the restless energy of a man waiting for a race to begin, his eyes darting toward the heavy silver tray, where the final papers lay in a leather-bound folio. The silver was tarnished at the edges, a small detail that Isabel noted with a pang of regret. It was the first sign of a house losing its discipline. The vicar began the liturgy, his voice a low, melodic drone that seemed to vibrate through the cold flagstone floors. "We gather to honor a life of stewardship," he murmured, but the words were interrupted by the sharp, metallic click of boot heels against the stone. Silas stood before the first prayer could conclude. He did not ask for the floor, he seized it. "A life of stewardship, perhaps," Silas cried, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "But a life currently being plundered by those we trusted to guard it." He turned his gaze toward Isabel, and for the first time in 10 years, she felt the full weight of social invisibility being transformed into a target. Silas reached into the folio and withdrew a heavy parchment document, the deed of gift that transferred the Ashbourne ancestral home and its surrounding 5,000 acres into the name of Isabel Thorne. A collective gasp rippled through the hall, a wave of shock that broke the carefully curated silence. Isabel Thorne did not flinch. She did not cry out in protest. She simply watched the shadow of the silver tray as it trembled in the hand of the constable. Justice Reginald Finch, who had been invited as a guest of honor, rose from his seat, his brow furrowing with professional interest. "Is this the document in question, Mr. Vane?" Justice Finch asked, his voice level and authoritative. "It is, my lord," Silas replied, his face flushed with a triumphant heat. "Signed 6 months ago, or so the ink claims. Yet we all know my uncle has not been able to hold a quill, let alone sign a legal instrument of this magnitude, for years. Look at the signature. It is fluid, it is perfect, it is a grotesque mockery of the hand of a dying man. This woman, this secretary, who lived under his roof and ate his bread, has used her proximity to forge a path to a fortune she did not earn." The disputed document was not a piece of parchment. It was a contract of war. Isabel looked at the document in the hand of Silas and remembered the cold, shivering night it had been signed, the way the eyes of Arthur Sterling had cleared for a single hour of lucidity. But she said nothing. She knew the logic of the room. A woman of no birth, found with a deed to a ducal estate, was a criminal by the very mathematics of their social order. "Isabel Thorne," Justice Finch stated, his eyes fixed on her with the cold detachment of the law. "You are accused of the forgery of the signature of a peer and the attempted theft of the Ashbourne estate. Constables, take her into custody." She did not resist. She did not beg for the mercy of a family that had never viewed her as more than a fixture of the library. As the heavy hands of the constabulary closed around her arms, she simply smoothed the silk of her mourning skirts and stepped forward. She walked through the sea of whispering aristocrats, with her head held high, her movement measured by the ticking of the long case clock in the hall. It was a matter of survival, not of emotion. The journey from the manor to the magistrate's office was a descent into a different kind of silence. The carriage was not the upholstered brougham of the Sterling family. but a black, iron-reinforced transport that smelled of damp wool and old tobacco. Isabel sat on the hard bench, the rhythmic jolting of the wheels over the cobblestones serving as a tactile ledger of her removal from society. Through the small, barred window, she'd watched the estate of Ashbourne retreat into the morning mist. The ancient oaks, heavy with the frost of late autumn, looked like silent sentinels mourning the loss of their true mistress. She watched the faces of the villagers as the carriage passed. They did not view her with hatred, but with the hollow curiosity one reserves for a fallen monument. To them, she had always been a shadow in the library windows. Now, the shadow had been cast out. The holding cell at the magistrate's office tasted of rust, stale rain, and the biting scent of lye. It was a small universe of grey stone, illuminated by a single high window that allowed a slant of weak sun to bisect the floor. The stones were cold, leaching the warmth from her bones. Isabel Thorne sat on the edge of the narrow cot, her back never touching the wall, her hands resting in her lap. The iron bars were not a barrier of steel. They were a boundary between the world of noise and the world of calculation. She had been counting the drips of water from a leak in the corner, 72 per minute, when the heavy outer door creaked open. Silas Vane stepped into the corridor, the smell of expensive tobacco and expensive desperation preceding him. He had removed his mourning cloak, revealing a waistcoat of embroidered silk that was far too festive for the occasion. He stood on the other side of the bars, looking down at Isabel with a smirk that did not quite reach his eyes. His eyes were red-rimmed, the telltale sign of one who had spent the previous night at a gaming table, losing money he did not have. "A far cry from the library, is it not, Isabel?" Silas asked, his voice echoing in the small chamber. "No tea service, no leather-bound volumes, just the cold reality of your own ambition." Isabel looked at him, her gaze as level as a balanced ledger. "The tea service was never mine, Mr. Vane. Nor were the books. I was merely their steward. I suspect you find the concept of stewardship difficult to grasp, given that you have spent the last 3 years attempting to liquidate assets you do not yet own." Silas flinched, his smirk faltering. "Do not lecture me on finance, you common clerk. You are facing 20 years of transportation. The evidence against you is insurmountable. I have already secured Professor Graham, the most respected forensic expert in London. He has seen the deed. Isabel." He called the signature suspiciously perfect. "He will testify that it is a physical impossibility for a man with the tremors of Arthur Sterling to have produced such a line." Isabel did not look away. "The tremors of a man are a matter of the body, Silas. The signature of a man is a matter of the soul. Your uncle knew exactly what he was doing when he placed that pen to paper. He was a vegetable," Silas shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of his own lies. He stepped closer to the bars, the smell of brandy now evident on his breath. "He has not known his own name in months. You whispered in his ear, did you not? You guided his hand, or perhaps you just practiced until you could mimic the ghost of who he used to be. You thought you could steal the seat of my family, but you forgot one thing. I am the blood. You are a mere servant." "Blood does not pay gambling debts, Silas," Isabel said quietly. "Nor does it keep a house from falling into insolvency. I have seen the records you tried to hide. I know about the mortgage on your London townhouse. I know about the vouchers you have signed in half the clubs in the city. You did not accuse me of forgery to protect the honor of the Duke. You accused me because you need Ashbourne to be sold to cover your own ruin." Silas gripped the iron bars, his knuckles turning white. For a moment, the mask of the arrogant aristocrat slipped, revealing the terrified, indebted man underneath. He looked at her not with contempt, but with a raw, feral hatred. "It does not matter what you know. You are in a cage and I am in the manor. Justice Finch values decorum above all else, and there is nothing more indecorous than a secretary who thinks she is a duchess. When Professor Graham stands in that witness box and tells the court that the signature is a fake, your words will be nothing but the desperate ramblings of a thief." He leaned in, his face inches from the bars. "I will give you one chance, Isabel. Sign a confession. Admit you forged the deed and say you were acting alone. If you do, I will speak to the judge. I will ask for mercy. A decade in a local prison rather than the colonies. You can spend your middle age in a cell, but at least you will be on English soil." Isabel Thorne stood up slowly. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach out to strike him. She simply walked to the bars until she was eye to eye with the man who had ruined her. The signature on that deed is the only honest thing left in the legacy of the Sterling family, Silas. I will not sign a lie to satisfy your creditors. I will stand in that court, and I will let the truth of the ink speak for itself." Silas let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "The truth of the ink? You are a fool. Ink is just liquid, Isabel. It flows wherever the man with the most power tells it to. Enjoy the damp. It is the last thing you will have in common with Ashbourne Manor." He turned on his heel and strode out, the heavy door slamming behind him with a finality that felt like the closing of a coffin lid. Isabel remained standing at the bars for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the dying light. She did not feel fear. Fear was an emotion for those who had something left to lose. Instead, she felt a cold, crystalline clarity. She began to count the drips of water again. 1, 2, 3. She was a creature of the ledger, a silent architect of order. Silas Vane thought he had trapped her in a ruin, but he had forgotten that she was the only person who knew exactly how the foundations were built. She sat back down on the cot, her spine as straight as a ruler, and waited for the morning. The trial would not be a battle of bloodlines, it would be a battle of precision, and Isabel Thorne had spent her entire life mastering the art of being precise. The ledger of her life was currently in shadow, but the final audit was yet to come. She closed her eyes and visualized the broken A in the signature of Arthur Sterling, the microscopic flaw that was his secret mark, his final, silent scream against the world that had tried to bury him. It was not just a letter, it was her weapon, and she would wait for the moment to use it. The London High Court smelled of ancient dust, damp wool, and the metallic tang of institutional fear. It was a cathedral dedicated to the preservation of the status quo, its soaring ceilings lost in a gloom that even the mid-morning sun could not pierce. Isabel Thorne stood in the prisoner's dock, her hands resting lightly on the polished oak railing. The wood was cold, a tactile reminder of the distance between her and the world of the living. She did not grip the rail. She did not allow her knuckles to turn white. Instead, she stood with a stillness that was almost architectural, her spine a column of unwavering resolve. She was wearing a dress of dark bombazine, the fabric stiff and unyielding, serving as a secondary skin that protected her from the voyeuristic gazes of the gallery. Behind her, the public benches were packed with the curious and the cruel, their whispers a low, persistent hum like the sound of flies over a carcass. Justice Reginald Finch sat upon the bench, his wig a mountain of powdered curls that seemed to weigh down his very soul. He looked at Isabel not with malice, but with the weary curiosity of a man who had seen 1,000 petty ambitions fail in this very room. To his left, Silas Vane sat with his legal counsel, his posture one of practiced mourning that was betrayed by the restless tapping of his fingers against his gold-headed cane. Silas averted his eyes from Isabel. He looked at the heavy leather folio on the prosecutor's table, the repository of the evidence he had meticulously manufactured to ensure her destruction. His eyes were fixed on the goal of securing the Ashbourne wealth to settle his mounting gambling debts. The air in the court was stagnant, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the sharp, acidic aroma of the ink that the clerks used to record the dissolution of a woman's life. The silence was broken by the calling of the first witness. Bartholomew Graham stepped into the box with the measured gait of a man who knew his own value to the penny. He was a world-renowned forensic document examiner, a man whose life was spent in the microscopic study of the human hand's failures. He carried a small velvet case, which he placed on the ledge, with a reverence usually reserved for religious relics. Professor Graham did not look like a man of science. He looked like a vulture who had swallowed a dictionary. His eyes, magnified behind thick spectacles, were cold and analytical, seeing not a person in the dock but a series of variables to be solved. "Professor Graham," the prosecutor began, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber, "you have had the opportunity to examine the document marked Exhibit A, the so-called deed of gift purported to have been signed by the Duke of Ashbourne." "I have," Graham replied, his voice a dry, rhythmic rasp that put Isabel in mind of parchment being folded. "And what was your primary observation regarding the signature of Arthur Sterling on that document?" Graham opened his velvet case and withdrew a magnifying glass with a brass rim that caught the weak light. The magnifying glass was not a tool of science. It was a lens of condemnation. My observation, sir, is that the signature is an impossibility. It is, in technical terms, suspiciously perfect. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a wave of sound that Justice Reginald Finch silenced with a single, sharp rap of his gavel. Isabel did not move. She watched the dust motes dancing in the light above the professor's head, counting the seconds of the silence. "Explain to the court what you mean by suspiciously perfect," the prosecutor prompted. Graham leaned forward, his spectacles glinting. "Handwriting is a physical map of the nerves and sinews, a record of the soul's decline. For 3 years I have consulted on the Duke's private correspondence. I have seen the topography of his decay. His true signature is a series of jagged peaks and sudden, violent valleys, the result of a hand that no longer obeys the mind's command to be smooth. The tremors associated with his condition are persistent, rhythmic, and entirely involuntary. They leave a specific chatter in the ink, a microscopic vibration that cannot be faked." He paused, holding up the contested transfer with a pair of silver tweezers. "This signature, however, possesses a serpentine fluidity. It is a single, unbroken arc of confidence. There is no hesitation, there is no tremor. To believe Arthur Sterling signed this is to believe that a man with broken legs could suddenly dance a minuet. It is a masterpiece of mimicry, executed by a hand that has practiced until the ghost of the Duke's former self has been perfectly captured. But it is a ghost, nonetheless. It is a forgery of the highest order, born of a long and calculated study of a dying man's past." Isabel watched Silas Vane as the professor spoke. The Duke's nephew was leaning back now, a faint, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. He was enjoying the technicality of the betrayal. To the world, the beauty of the signature was proof of its lies. They saw the grace of the line as a mark of the thief. Isabel, however, remembered the weight of the Duke's hand on that night, the way his fingers had suddenly ceased their dance of agitation and found a momentary, icy stillness. She remembered the smell of the storm outside and the scratch of the quill against the heavy paper. But in this room her memory was not evidence. It was merely a symptom of her supposed guilt. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, his expression one of grave concern. "Professor Graham, in your professional opinion, could any medical intervention account for such a dramatic restoration of motor control?" "In 40 years of study," Graham stated, his voice flat and final, "I have never seen a pathology retreat so completely for a single signature. The body does not forget its ruin for the sake of a legal contract. This document was not signed by a duke. It was manufactured by a secretary." Justice Reginald Finch turned his gaze toward the dock. "Does the defense wish to cross-examine this witness?" Isabel's solicitor, a man of diminishing prospects, rose slowly. His robes were frayed at the sleeves, a silent testament to the meager funds Isabel had been able to provide from her own small savings. He looked at Professor Graham, then at the signature on the deed, and then, with a flicker of hopelessness, at Isabel. "Professor," the defense solicitor began, his voice lacking the resonance of the prosecution's, "is it not true that the human spirit can, under extreme duress or clarity, overcome the physical limitations of the body for a brief moment?" "We are in a court of law, sir, not a theatre of romantic poetry," Graham replied, a sneer curling his lip. "The ink does not lie. The physics of the tremor are recorded in the fibers of the paper. There is no spirit in a quill. There is only pressure and resistance, and this signature lacks the resistance of a failing body. It is a matter of mathematics, not of emotion." The defense solicitor sat down, his defeat as visible as a stain on a white cloth. The prosecution then moved to the next phase of their theatre. They produced a large exhibit board, a heavy wooden frame that had been carried in by 2 bailiffs. On it were pinned several documents, arranged with a geometric precision that mimicked a ledger of doom. On the left side were the Duke's real signatures from the past year, shaky, blotted, and often trailing off into illegible scratches that looked like the tracks of a wounded bird in the snow. On the right side, rendered in grand, painstaking detail by an engraver's hand, was the signature from the contested transfer. The contrast was staggering. It was the difference between a ruin and a monument. The prosecutor walked to the board, a long wooden pointer in his hand. He tapped the Duke's genuine signatures with a rhythmic, percussive sound that echoed the ticking of the court's heavy clock. "Look at the degradation, gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor urged, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Look at the topography of decay, as the professor so elegantly put it. Here we see a man losing his grip on the world. And then, he swung the pointer to the right, the tip landing squarely on the signature of the grand bequest. And then we see this, the perfect fake, the signature of a phantom who does not exist. He turned back to the gallery, his eyes finding Isabel Thorne. The defense would have you believe in miracles. They would have you believe that on a random Tuesday in May, a man who could not hold a spoon suddenly regained the precision of an engraver. But we know the truth. We know that the only thing that changed in May was the ambition of the woman standing in that dock. She did not find a miracle. She found a bottle of ink and a quiet hour in the Duke's study. She did not witness a restoration, she choreographed a theft. Isabel watched the pointer as it rested on the signature. She declined to meet the prosecutor's gaze. Her gaze settled on the capital A in Arthur Sterling's name. From this distance, the enlarged reproduction made the ink look like a river of black stone. And there, at the very crossbar of the A, was the microscopic gap she had been waiting for. The broken A was not a literal break in the metal of the nib. It was a deliberate, microscopic lifting of the pen that the Duke had used for 40 years as a silent authentication. It was a secret he had shared with no one but her, a private language of survival in a world of social vultures. The prosecution continued their assault, highlighting the lack of medical degradation in the signature. They spoke of the Duke's physician, Dr. Edmund Graves, who would later testify to the Duke's total incapacity. They painted a picture of a house in chaos, of a loyal nephew, Silas Vane, attempting to protect the lineage while a calculating secretary worked in the shadows to subvert the laws of inheritance. The words manipulative, climbing, and deceptive were used with a frequency that suggested they were the only adjectives the prosecutor knew. Isabel remained motionless. She felt the eyes of the court on her, the weight of their collective judgment pressing against her chest. She was a woman of no status, a woman whose only power lay in her competence and her records. In this room, that competence was being used as the primary evidence of her criminality. They saw her skill as a weapon. They saw her silence as a confession. The exhibit board, the prosecutor concluded, his voice rising to a triumphant crescendo, is the ledger of this woman's crimes. It shows the gap between reality and her ambition. It is a visual representation of a lie so bold it defies belief. We rest our case for the morning on the physical evidence alone, the evidence of the ink that cannot be refuted. Justice Reginald Finch looked at the clock. The court will adjourn for a midday recess. The prisoner will be returned to the holding cell. We will resume at 2 o'clock for the testimony of Dr. Edmund Graves. The bailiffs stepped forward, their hands reaching for Isabel's arms with a practiced, indifferent strength. She did not wait for them to touch her. She stepped out of the dock herself, her movement as fluid and controlled as the signature they so despised. She walked back through the corridor of whispers, the scent of the court's stagnant air, replaced by the cold, biting smell of the stone stairs leading down to the cells. She was back in the world of grey light and dripping water. The cell was exactly as she had left it, a small universe of silence where the only thing that moved was the dust. Isabel sat on the cot, her hands folded in her lap. She was not defeated. She was a creature of the long game, a woman who understood that a trial, like an estate, was a matter of stewardship. The prosecution had presented their theatre. They had shown the world the perfect fake. They had used their experts and their boards to build a wall of logic around her. But they had forgotten one thing. They had forgotten that Arthur Sterling was still alive, a prisoner in his own body, waiting for the moment to speak. And she had forgotten nothing. She closed her eyes and counted the drips from the corner. 1, 2, 3. The ledger was not yet closed. The final audit of Ashbourne Manor would not be conducted by a professor with a magnifying glass, but by the man who had lived within the ruins, and Isabel Thorne, the silent architect of his final will, would wait for the clock to strike the hour of his return. She was not a forger, she was a guardian, and the truth of the ink was a debt that would be paid in full before the sun set on the London High Court. The memory was not a dream, it was a ledger entry, recorded in the indelible ink of her own survival. 6 months ago, the sky over Ashbourne Manor had been the color of a bruised plum, and the rain had lashed against the library windows, like a handful of thrown gravel. The house had been silent, save for the rhythmic, unsettling creak of the ancient timbers and the distant, muffled cough of the wind in the chimneys. Isabel Thorne had been sitting at the small mahogany desk in the Duke's bedchamber, the light from a single beeswax candle casting long, trembling shadows against the silk wallpaper. Arthur Sterling lay in the great four-poster bed, his breathing a shallow, staccato rasp that seemed to catch on the very edges of the silence. To the world, he was a statue of a man, a relic of a dying line whose mind had long since retreated into the grey mists of a failing body. She did not sleep. She did not pray. She counted. She counted the seconds between his breaths, measuring the decline of a kingdom by the pulse of a failing heart. The air in the room was thick with the scent of camphor, dried lavender, and the metallic tang of the storm outside. Suddenly, the rhythm of the room shifted. The Duke's hand, which had been a knotted mass of involuntary tremors for weeks, suddenly stilled. His fingers, thin and pale as bone, gripped the edge of the heavy linen sheet with a sudden shocking strength. Isabel stood, her movements silent and precise. She did not call for the nurse. She did not cry out in surprise. She moved to the bedside and looked into the eyes of the man she had served for a decade. They were not the clouded, sightless orbs of the past year. They were sharp, crystalline, and burning with a terrifying clarity. Arthur Sterling was back, a prisoner who had found a momentary gap in the iron bars of his own condition. "The ledger, Isabel," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like parchment being torn. "Bring me the Ashbourne ledger and the deed." Isabel Thorne did not hesitate. She did not question the impossibility of the moment. She knew the grammar of his will better than she knew the sound of her own voice. She moved to the hidden safe behind the portrait of the first Duchess, her fingers finding the combination with a speed born of years of stewardship. The heavy leather-bound book was not a record of accounts. It was a weapon of preservation. Beside it lay the drafted charter, the document she had prepared in secret on the nights when Silas Vane's gambling debts had grown too loud to ignore. "They think I am gone," the Duke murmured as she placed the parchment on a silver tray and moved it to the bed. "Silas thinks he can sell the stones of this house to pay for his sins. He has already begun the harvest of my ruin. He has bribed graves. He has turned the servants into spies. But he has forgotten that I am still the master of Ashbourne." Isabel held the candle closer. The Duke reached for the quill. His hand was steady, a phenomenon that defied every medical logic she had ever known. It was as if the sheer force of his indignation had forged a temporary bridge over the tremors of his disease. He dipped the nib into the inkwell, the black liquid shimmering like a dark secret in the flickering light. "He will call it a forgery," the Duke said, looking at the blank line where his legacy would be decided. "He will say, a man in my state could never produce a line so clean. He will bring his experts and his judges to say I was already dead while I yet breathed. Then do not give him a line he can refute, Your Grace," Isabel replied, her voice level and calm. "Give him the truth that only you possess." Arthur Sterling looked at the paper for a long minute. Then, with a movement that was deliberate and slow, he signed. The ink flowed across the parchment in a serpentine arc of defiance. It was a signature of profound elegance, a ghost of the hand he had possessed 30 years ago. But as he reached the crossbar of the capital A in his name, he paused. He lifted the pen for a fraction of a second, leaving a microscopic, jagged break in the horizontal stroke. A flaw so small it would appear to be a stutter of the nib to any casual observer. It was his secret mark, a private cipher he had used since his youth to authenticate his most personal warrants. The signing was not a legal act. It was a private art of survival. The Duke set the pen down, and as the last stroke of the A dried, the clarity in his eyes began to flicker like a dying flame. The tremors returned, his hand falling back to the sheets in a rhythmic, agitated dance. The window of lucidity had closed, the iron bars of his condition slamming shut once more. But the deed was signed. Isabel Thorne took the parchment, her fingers brushing the wet ink. She did not feel the cold of the room. She felt the weight of the contract. The signed grant was not a gift of wealth. It was a mandate of war. She rolled the parchment, placed it within the secret compartment of the ledger, and returned the book to the safe just as the heavy footsteps of Dr. Graves echoed in the corridor. In the present, while Isabel sat in the cold damp of the holding cell, The study of Ashbourne Manor was a theatre of frantic preservation. The room tasted of stale brandy and the sharp, ozone-scented anxiety of men who had built their futures on the foundation of a lie. Silas Vane stood by the heavy oak desk, his fingers trembling as he sifted through a stack of gambling vouchers that represented a debt larger than the estate's annual yield. Across from him, Dr. Edmund Graves paced the length of the Persian rug, his boots scuffing the intricate patterns with a lack of decorum that would have horrified the Duke in his prime. The medical chart lay open between them, a record of dosages and sedatives that was not a healer's journal, but a map of a living man's imprisonment. "The trial is moving too slowly, Graves." Silas snapped, his voice tight with a desperation he could no longer mask with his aristocratic veneer. "The gallery is beginning to whisper." They saw the way that woman stood in the dock. They saw her silence. Silence in a courtroom is a vacuum, and the public will fill it with whatever heroics they can imagine. "We need the conviction by Friday, or the creditors will be at the gates of Ashbourne before the ink on the verdict is dry." Graves stopped pacing, his face pale in the low light of the desk lamp. "I have given my testimony to the prosecutor, Silas. I have documented his decline with a precision that would satisfy any board of surgeons. I have sworn that he hasn't been lucid for a year. But the medication, if anyone audits the apothecary records, they will see the shifts. They will see that we have been using laudanum not for pain, but for silence. The apothecary is paid to be blind, just as you are paid to be certain," Silas said, stepping closer to the doctor. "What of the lucid intervals? You told me they were a physical impossibility. Yet Graham's testimony today about the perfection of that signature, it has made me uneasy. What if he had a moment? What if that girl managed to catch him in an hour of clarity? A lucid interval is a medical anomaly, Silas, a ghost story told by lawyers," Graves replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Even if he had a moment of awareness, the motor control require that signature is beyond the capacity of his nervous system. The tremors are mechanical. They are a fault in the machinery of the man. No amount of willpower can fix a broken spring. That signature is a forgery because it has to be. If it is real, then everything we have done, the sequestration, the sedatives, the redirected mail, is a crime against the Crown." Silas turned to the window, looking out at the misty grounds of the estate. The trees were black skeletons against the grey sky. "The girl knows something." She didn't flinch when Graham called it a fake. She examined the exhibit board as if she were reading a ledger she had already balanced. "She is counting on something, Graves. She is a creature of the library. She doesn't act on emotion. She acts on data. If there is a flaw in our logic, she has found it. Then we must ensure the data is rewritten," Graves said, reaching for the medical chart. "I will update the notes for the month of May. I will record a series of severe seizures that would make any physical act of writing a laughable claim. We will bury her under a mountain of physiological evidence. The judge values my reputation, Silas. I am the Duke's physician. She is merely the help." Silas Vane did not look comforted. He touched the gold head of his cane, his mind already calculating the next move. "The deed was not a document. It was a death warrant. If she is exonerated, I am ruined. The mortgage on my London house is being called in. The vouchers I signed at White's are being traded like common currency. I need Ashbourne, Graves. I need the timber, the coal, and the land. And I need that woman to be silenced permanently." "She will be," Graves promised, his voice a low murmur of complicity. "The law is a matter of authority, not of truth. And in this county, we are the authority. I will testify at 2 o'clock. I will tell the jury that the presiding lord is a hollow shell, a patient who has forgotten the very shape of a pen. By the time I am finished, she will be lucky if they only transport her to the colonies." Silas nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the misty horizon. He felt the ticking of the clock in the hall, a rhythmic reminder that time was a debt that was rapidly coming due. He did not see the irony of his situation, that he was a man trapped in a prison of his own making, while Isabel Thorne, in her stone cell, was the only one who truly held the keys. The study was thick with the scent of old paper and new betrayals. The medical chart was not a record of health. It was a contract of deceit. And as the two men stood in the shadows of the Duke's legacy, they did not hear the distant sound of wheels on the gravel, or the silent, gathering storm of a restoration they could no longer prevent. The ledger was being audited, and the final balance would be paid in the blood of the guilty. The afternoon session of the High Court commenced with a sharp chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the hall. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool and the stale aroma of the previous hour's mutton pies, a sensory reminder of the mundane world that continued to turn while Isabel Thorne's life was being dismantled. She returned to the prisoner's dock with her head held high, her spine a rigid column of unwavering dignity. She did not look at the gallery, where the whispering had reached a feverish pitch. She refrained from watching Silas Vane, who sat with his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Instead, she looked at the heavy brass clock on the far wall, counting the rhythmic, metallic swings of the pendulum. 60 seconds to a minute. 10 minutes to the resumption of her ruin. The prosecutor stood to address the bench, his voice possessing the dry, percussive quality of a drum. He held a weathered leather portfolio, opening it with a deliberate slowness that commanded the room's undivided attention. "My lord," he began, his gaze sweeping over the jury, "thus far we have discussed the signature itself. We have heard from Professor Graham that the Duke could not have produced such a hand. But how did a common secretary achieve such a masterwork of deceit? The answer was found in the prisoner's own quarters. He withdrew a stack of cream-colored pages. They were scraps of paper, margers of old ledgers, the backs of invitations, and strips of parchment discarded from the library. As he laid them upon the evidence table, a collective intake of breath hissed through the courtroom. They were practice sheets. On every page, written hundreds of times in varying degrees of precision, was the name of Arthur Sterling. The practice sheets were not mere fragments of paper. They were a blueprint of a betrayal. Isabel watched them being displayed, her fingers tightening against the oak railing of the dock. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. She simply observed the quality of the ink, noting the way it sat upon the surface of the paper. It was a thin, acidic blue-black that lacked the rich, velvety depth of the library's private stock. Silas had been thorough, but he had not been meticulous in his choice of materials. "Look at the progression, gentlemen," the prosecutor urged, his pointer tapping a beat against the wood. "In the early attempts, we see a hand that is uncertain, but as we move through the sheets, the hand grows bolder. By the 10th page, the secretary has captured the soul of her employer. She has practiced until she could sign his name in the dark. She has rehearsed his death before it even arrived." Isabel felt the weight of 1,000 judgments pressing against her chest. To the jury, these sheets were the smoking gun of her ambition. They did not see the impossibility of her having such leisure. They did not know that her nights were spent auditing the very accounts Silas was plundering, or sitting by the Duke's bedside measuring his shallow breaths. In the architecture of this courtroom, the truth was a flexible thing, shaped by whoever held the most convincing props. "Officer," the prosecutor called, and a man in a dark blue tunic stepped forward to be sworn in. "You conducted the search of Miss Thorne's apartment within the servants' wing of Ashbourne Manor." "I did, sir," the constable replied. "Found them tucked beneath the floorboards, right under her writing desk. Wrapped in oilcloth they were, to keep the damp from ruining the work." "And was there anything else? Any other tools of the trade?" "A set of steel nibs, sir, and a bottle of ink that matched the marks on these pages. It was all hidden away, neat as you please." Isabel looked at Silas Vane. For a fleeting second, his gaze met hers, and she saw the cold, flickering light of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. He had planted the evidence with the same methodical precision she used to manage the estate. He had used her own habits against her, her love of order, her hidden storage spaces, her solitary nights. She did not feel anger. She felt a cold, analytical disappointment in the law. Justice Reginald Finch peered over his spectacles at the practice sheets, his expression unreadable beneath the weight of his powdered wig. "The prisoner will remain seated," Justice Finch stated. "The court acknowledges the gravity of this physical evidence. Mr. Prosecutor, you may proceed." As the witness stepped down, the room seemed to contract. Isabel remained a statue in the dock, her mind working through the variables of her defense. They were using her skill as a secretary to prove she was a thief. She closed her eyes for a single second, visualizing the broken A on the original deed, the one detail they had all missed. It was a matter of timing, not of desperation. The gavel fell. with a final echoing crack that seemed to shatter the remaining light in the hall. Isabel was led away in a silence, so heavy it felt like a physical weight, the low, predatory hum of the gallery's judgment following her until the heavy doors of the court ground shut. The trial was a machine, and she was the grain being ground between its gears. But machines could be jammed by the smallest of technicalities, and Isabel Thorne was the mistress of the minute. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the holding cell, her bombazine skirts rustling. The stone walls leached the last of the day's warmth from the air. The heavy outer bolt groaned, revealing a figure in a grey cloak. The visitor moved with the hesitant gait of someone who had spent their life in service. "Isabel, is that you, child?" The voice smelled of lavender and kitchen soap. "Martha," Isabel said. Standing slowly, her voice was level, but a faint softening touched her eyes. Martha Higgins, the housekeeper of Ashbourne Manor, stepped into the pool of light. She stared at the iron bars with visceral horror, her eyes welling with tears. "I shouldn't be here," Martha whispered, glancing back at the corridor. "If Mr. Silas knew I'd come to London, he'd have me in the parish house before the sun rose. But I couldn't let it stand, Isabel. I couldn't sit by." Isabel moved to the bars, her hand resting on the metal. "The practice sheets, Martha. They found them in my room. They say I hid them beneath the floorboards." Martha's hands emerged from her shawl, trembling. "I saw him, Isabel, 3 nights after they took you. I was coming up the back stairs with the tea service. The halls were dark, but I saw a light in your quarters." She paused, her breath a-hitching. "It was Mr. Silas. He was kneeling on the floor by your desk, with a crowbar in his hand, prying up the boards. He was tucking a parcel of paper and a bottle into the gap. He was muttering about the debt and the final stroke. The tea set was not a collection of porcelain. It was a witness to a crime." Isabel absorbed the information with clinical detachment. "Did anyone else see him, Martha?" "No one," Martha sobbed. "The house is in terror. Dr. Graves has the Duke locked away, and Silas has fired anyone who asks a question. He's already promised the library to a dealer. He thinks he's won. He thinks that with you gone, there's no one left to count the cost." Isabel squeezed the older woman's hand. The contact was a sensory anchor, a reminder of the house she had fought to preserve. "You cannot testify, Martha. He would destroy you. He has the law on his side, and you have only your word against a gentleman's." "But the truth, Isabel. The truth is a ledger that must be balanced, Martha, and we are not yet at the final entry," Isabel said, her voice dropping to an authoritative hum. "Go back to Ashbourne, watch the Duke. If he has another moment of clarity, you must ensure he is not sedated. Do you understand? Dr. Graves is using the laudanum to keep the mind asleep while the body survives. You must switch the vials." Martha looked at her with fear and awe. "You're asking me to commit a crime." "I am asking you to practice the art of stewardship," Isabel corrected. "The Duke is being held prisoner in his own home. If I am to be exonerated, he is the only witness who matters. Silas has forgotten that the master of Ashbourne is not yet dead. He has counted his coins before the audit is finished." The housekeeper wiped her eyes and withdrew a small linen-wrapped parcel. "I brought you some bread and a bit of cheese. And some tea. It's cold now, but it's from the library canister. I thought it might make the stones feel less like a grave." Isabel took the parcel, the scent of the library's Earl Grey rising from the fabric. It was a small private mercy in a world of public cruelty. "Thank you, Martha. Now go, before the guard changes." She watched the housekeeper retreat into the shadows, the footsteps fading into the silence of the magistrate's office. Isabel sat back down and unwrapped the bread. She did not eat with the desperation of a starving woman. She ate with the methodical focus of a soldier. The practice sheets were a powerful blow, a piece of theatre designed to turn the jury's stomach. But Martha's visit had provided the missing piece of the architecture. Silas was not just arrogant. He was frightened. He had planted evidence because he knew the original signature held a secret he could not replicate. She took a sip of the cold tea, the bitter, bergamot-scented liquid a sharp contrast to the stale air. She was no longer just a defendant. She was a strategist. The practice sheets were the prosecution's weapon, but they were also their greatest weakness. Silas had assumed she practiced the signature to steal the estate. He had not realized that the signature he was trying to mimic was not a forgery, but a trap. She lay down on the hard mattress, her bombazine skirts tucked neatly. She did not dream of the gallows. She visualized the courtroom, the exhibit board, and the microscopic gap in the capital A. She counted the drips of water from the ceiling, syncing her pulse to the rhythm of the stone. 1, 2, 3. The ledger was being audited, and whilst Silas Vane was busy counting his imaginary wealth, Isabel Thorne was busy preparing the final reckoning. She was a creature of the library, a silent architect of order, and she would wait for the clock to strike the hour when the ink would finally speak the truth. The world saw a forger, she saw a guardian, and the debt of the Sterling family was about to be paid in a currency they never expected. The absolute mathematical certainty of a dying man's will. The third day of the trial commenced not with the grandiloquence of the law, but with a silence so absolute, it felt like a physical weight upon the chest of every soul in the chamber. The London High Court was a cavern of grey light and ancient petrified expectations, its rafters thick with the dust of centuries of institutionalized cruelty. Isabel Thorne stood in the prisoner's dock, her hands resting upon the cold oak rail, with a precision that bordered on the mathematical. She did not allow her shoulders to slump. She did not allow the frantic, rhythmic thudding of the gallery's whispers to disturb the internal ledger of her composure. She was wearing the same dress of dark bombazine, the fabric now carrying the faint, metallic scent of the holding cell's stone walls. Yet she wore it with the grace of a woman who had never known the meaning of social submission. She was counting the swings of the clock's pendulum, 124 since the justice had taken his seat. To the world, the case was already closed, the practice sheets found beneath her floorboards serving as the final, damning entry in the record of her supposed crimes. Silas Vane sat at the prosecution table, his posture one of relaxed, predatory triumph. He held the heavy leather folio containing the estate conveyance not as a legal document, but as a map of the acres he was about to liquidate. Beside him, Dr. Edmund Graves waited to be called, his fingers nervously smoothing the silk of his cravat. His eyes avoiding the dock where the woman he had helped to ruin stood in silent, frozen judgment. The court will hear the final medical testimony before the jury retires, Justice Reginald Finch announced, his voice echoing through the vaulted gloom like the striking of a hammer on a cold anvil. Dr. Graves, you will take the stand to confirm the estate owner's total incapacity on the date the deed was allegedly executed. Dr. Graves stood, his movement hesitant, his boots scuffing the floor with a sound that Isabel noted as the friction of a guilty conscience. But before his hand could reach for the Holy Bible, the heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the courtroom groaned upon their hinges. It was a sound that did not belong to the choreographed rhythm of the trial. A violent, unscripted intrusion of the outside world. The gallery turned as one, a wave of dark wool and silk rustling in the dim light. The entry was not a flourish. It was a slow, agonizingly quiet procession. 2 footmen in the faded grey livery of Ashbourne Manor entered first, their faces set in masks of terrified determination. Between them, they guided a wheelchair of dark, polished walnut, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the flagstone floor with a percussive, metallic rhythm that seemed to sync with the ticking of the court's heavy clock. The man seated within the chair was a ghost rendered in flesh and bone. Arthur Sterling, the lord of the manor, was draped in a heavy travelling cloak of midnight blue, his frame so diminished it seemed the fabric alone provided the structure for his existence. His skin was the colour of old parchment, translucent and brittle, yet his head was held with a fragile, unwavering pride. The wheelchair was not a chair of infirmity. It was a throne of reckoning. Isabel Thorne did not flinch, though she felt a sudden, sharp heat behind her eyes that she sternly suppressed. She watched the Duke's hands, the same hands that had signed the deed in the dark of a storm. They were pale and thin, resting upon a blanket of sterling tartan, and for the first time in 3 years, they were motionless. The tremors that had defined his public ruin had been replaced by an icy, terrifying stillness. A collective gasp, sharp as a winter wind, swept through the room. Silas Vane surged to his feet, his gold-headed cane clattering to the floor with a hollow, echoing sound. His face, previously flushed with the heat of his victory, turned the grey of a dead hearth. "This is an outrage," Silas shouted, his voice cracking, the thin veneer of the gentleman shattering to reveal the desperate debtor beneath. "My uncle is a dying man. He has no place in this circus. This is a grotesque manipulation by the defense." Justice Reginald Finch did not rap his gavel. He leaned forward, his spectacles sliding to the bridge of his nose, his gaze fixed on the man in the wheelchair. "Arthur?" the justice whispered, the formality of the bench momentarily forgotten in the face of a miracle or a haunting. The Duke paid no heed to the justice. He ignored the gallery of vultures who had already divided his estate in their minds. His gaze, sharp and crystalline as a winter morning, moved slowly across the room until it found the prisoner's dock. He looked at Isabel Thorne, and in that moment, the ledger of their decade of shared silence was finally in perfect balance. He saw the ink-stained fingers she tried to hide. He saw the straightness of her spine. He saw the guardian who had weathered the storm he had set in motion. "I am here," the Duke said. His voice was not the shallow rasp of the bedchamber. It was a low, resonant bell that cut through the stagnant air of the court. It was a voice of stewardship, of authority, and of a patriarch who had clawed his way back from the edge of the grave for a single hour of justice. The courtroom became a theater of frantic, uncoordinated panic. Dr. Graves attempted to step toward the Duke, his hand reaching for a medical bag that now contained only the evidence of his own malpractice. "Your Grace, you are not well," Graves stammered, his voice trembling with the knowledge that his false charts were now a confession. The excitement, the strain. "We must return you to Ashbourne at once. Stand back, Edmund," the Duke commanded, his eyes never leaving the doctor's face. "I have had enough of your sedatives. I have had enough of the silence you and my nephew bought with sterling gold. The fog has cleared, and I find the view of this room quite illuminating." Silas Vane's lawyer, a man whose reputation was built on the successful defense of the indefensible, rose with a flourish of his silk robes. "My lord, the law is clear. A man who has been declared medically incompetent, a man whose own physician has sworn to his cognitive decline, cannot be admitted as a witness. This is a theatrical ploy. His Grace does not know where he is, let alone the contents of a complex legal deed." The Duke turned his head toward the lawyer, a faint, cold smile touching his lips. "I know exactly where I am. Sir, I am in the High Court of London, presided over by my old friend Reginald Finch. I am here because my nephew found the cost of his gambling debts more significant than the life of his benefactor. And I am here because the woman you have called a thief is the only person in this county who knows the true value of a signature." Justice Finch cleared his throat, the weight of his office returning to him. "Arthur, the prosecution has presented evidence, practice sheets found in Miss Thorne's quarters, suggesting she spent months mimicking your hand. They claim the signature on the deed of gift is suspiciously perfect, a feat of forgery that your physical condition rendered impossible. Is that what they say?" The Duke's voice was dry, the sound of a pen scratching on heavy paper. "They see the perfection of the line, and they call it a lie. They see the absence of a tremor, and they call it a crime. They have forgotten that a man is not merely the sum of his infirmities. They have forgotten that even a ruin can have a moment of restoration." He turned his gaze back to Silas, who was now leaning against the prosecution table, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. "Tell me, Silas," the Duke asked, his voice echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence. "When you planted those sheets in Isabel's room, did you use the same acidic ink you used to forge the vouchers at White's? I have seen the records of your debts, my boy. I have audited the ledger, you thought. I was too blind to read. You thought the laudanum would keep the mind asleep while you stripped the house of its bones. The Duke is speaking from a state of delirium," Silas's lawyer cried, though his voice was drowned out by the roar of the gallery. Justice Finch pounded his gavel, the sound finally restoring a semblance of order. "Arthur Sterling," Justice Finch said, his voice grave. "The medical records provided by Dr. Graves state that for the past 6 months, you have suffered from persistent seizures and a total loss of lucidity. How do you account for your presence here today? How do you account for the clarity of your speech and the stillness of your hand?" The Duke looked at Isabel, a microscopic nod passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of the switch of the medication vials that Martha Higgins had performed under the cover of night. "The accounting is quite simple, Reginald," the Duke stated, looking back at the judge. "My physician was not treating my condition. He was managing my disappearance. He was administering dosages of laudanum that would have felled a horse, ensuring that my only public appearance would be in a coffin. But stewardship is a persistent art. My secretary, Miss Thorne, recognized the pattern of my decline for what it was. A systematic poisoning of the mind. He paused, his hand moving to the blanket. With the help of a loyal servant and a change in the treatment Graves so generously provided, I found a lucid interval. It was not a miracle of the spirit, sir. It was a matter of chemistry and the removal of a corrupt influence. I signed that deed 6 months ago, during the first hour of clarity I had known in a year. I signed it because I knew that if Ashbourne were left to my blood, it would be sold to the highest bidder before my heart stopped beating. I signed it to Isabel Thorne because she is the only person who treats the stones of my house as a legacy rather than a commodity. The prosecutor stepped forward, his face a mask of professional skepticism. And the signature, Your Grace? Even in a lucid moment, Professor Graham has testified that the physical tremors would have prevented such a smooth, fluid line. He called it an impossibility. Professor Graham is a man who studies the map of a hand, not the will of a man, the Duke replied, his voice rising in strength. He saw the smoothness of the ink, and he saw a forgery. He did not see the broken A. He did not see the secret mark I have used for 40 years to distinguish my true will from the administrative noise of my office. Isabel Thorne felt the world tilt. The mention of the secret mark, the microscopic gap in the crossbar of the capital letter, was the final decisive blow in the audit of her life. She studied the exhibit board, where the enlarged signature hung like a trophy of her guilt. She saw the gap. She saw the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. "Bring the document to me," the Duke commanded. The bailiff hesitated, looking to Justice Finch. The justice nodded, his expression one of grim anticipation. The momentous parchment was carried across the courtroom, the parchment rustling in the stagnant air. It was placed into the Duke's hands. He did not use a magnifying glass. He did not need the silver tweezers of an expert. He touched the ink with the tip of his finger, his eyes closing for a second as if he were reading the soul of the paper. "This is not a forgery," Arthur Sterling whispered, his voice carrying to the very back of the hall. "This is the only real thing in this room. Every other document my nephew has produced, every voucher, every mortgage, every false medical entry, is a lie written in the ink of desperation. But this is my hand, and I recognize it as my own, not because of its perfection, but because of its intent." He looked up at Silas, his eyes cold and final. "You thought you were counting my mistakes, Silas, but you were the only one being measured. The audit of Ashbourne Manor is complete, and the ledger is in perfect balance." Silas Vane did not speak. He did not attempt another protest. He sank back into his chair, his face buried in his hands, the weight of his own insolvency finally crushing the life from his ambition. The gallery was silent, the previous hum of cruelty replaced by a profound, echoing awe. Isabel Thorne remained in the dock, her spine still straight, her hands still resting on the rail. She did not weep. She did not celebrate. She simply watched the Duke as he leaned back in his chair, the effort of his restoration beginning to take its toll. The medical explanation was not a testimony of health. It was a testimony of character. The exposure of Silas was not a legal victory. It was a moral reckoning. And as the clock in the hall struck the hour, Isabel Thorne knew that the architecture of her survival was finally complete. The world saw a man in a wheelchair. She saw the master of Ashbourne. The world saw a secretary. He saw the future of his line. And the truth of the ink, recorded in the secret, broken strokes of a dying man's hand, was a debt that was finally being settled in the currency of honor. The ledger of the Sterling family was no longer in shadow. It was at last illuminated by the cold, clear light of justice. The London High Court held its breath, a vast, echoing chamber of stone and shadow where the very air seemed to have solidified into a monument of suspense. At the center of this architectural silence, Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Ashbourne, sat in his walnut wheelchair, the weight of the midnight blue traveling cloak gathered around his frail shoulders like the mantle of a king returning from exile. He held the deed of gift in his hands, his fingers, once thought to be perpetually enslaved by the tremors of his decline, now possessed of a terrifying crystalline stillness. The parchment was not merely a legal instrument, it was a kingdom of intent, and every eye in the gallery was fixed upon the dark, serpentine line of the signature that had brought Isabel Thorne to the brink of the gallows. Professor Bartholomew Graham stood frozen beside the Duke, his magnifying glass still clutched in a hand that had begun to tremble with a very unscientific uncertainty. The expert, who had built a career upon the cold mathematics of the quill, found himself confronted by the living source of the ink he had so confidently analyzed. Arthur Sterling looked up at him, his winter-grey eyes sharp and predatory, a stark contrast to the translucent fragility of his skin. The silence was measured by the rhythmic, percussive ticking of the heavy brass clock, a sound that seemed to sync with the steady, quiet pulse of Isabel Thorne as she stood in the dock, her spine a straight line of ebony against the grey light of the court. "You called this signature an impossibility, Professor," Arthur Sterling stated, his voice a low, resonant bell that vibrated through the flagstone floor. "You looked at the fluidity of the arc and saw only the mimicry of a thief. You saw the absence of a tremor and declared it a masterpiece of deceit. You were so busy mapping the topography of a dying man's hand that you forgot to look for the soul of the writer." The Duke turned the parchment toward the light of the high, arched windows. He did not use a lens. He used the memory of 40 years of stewardship. "Look here, at the crossbar of the capital A," Arthur Sterling commanded, his finger hovering just above the ink. "Every person in this room sees a perfect line. Every expert sees a flawless fake. But I see a secret. I see the lift of the nib that I have performed since the day I took my seat at Ashbourne Manor. It is a microscopic gap, a jagged stutter in the ink that occurs when the hand is moved by a specific private will rather than a mechanical habit. It is my broken A, the mark of an individual who knows that in a world of social vultures the only true safety lies in a detail that cannot be seen, only recognized." Professor Bartholomew Graham leaned in, his spectacles nearly touching the document. The gallery leaned with him, a collective movement of 500 bodies that sounded like the rustle of dry leaves in a cathedral. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the scratching of a clerk's pen in the distance. Then, the expert's face drained of color, the gray of his skin matching the dust on his velvet case. He saw it. He saw the microscopic flaw that transformed a perfect forgery into an absolute truth. The signature was not a forgery because it was too smooth. It was the hand of Arthur Sterling because, for that 1 hour of lucidity, the master of Ashbourne had reclaimed his body to protect his legacy. It is there," Professor Graham whispered, his voice a dry, rattling ghost of its former authority, a deliberate lift. "It is not a tremor, it is a signature of profound control." A roar of sound erupted from the gallery, a wave of shock and indignation that Justice Reginald Finch silenced with a single, thunderous rap of his gavel. The sound was not merely a call for order, it was the final decisive period at the end of a long sentence of injustice. Silas Vane slumped back into his chair, his face a mask of raw, feral terror. The gold head of his cane slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor with a hollow sound that echoed the emptiness of his own future. He spared no glance for Arthur Sterling. He looked at the floor, the weight of his mounting gambling debts and his failed betrayals finally crushing the air from his lungs. Justice Reginald Finch leaned forward, his gaze moving from the Duke to the woman in the dock. "The court has heard the testimony of the author," the justice announced, his voice heavy with the gravity of the revelation. "In light of the physical evidence being authenticated by Arthur Sterling himself, the charges of forgery against Isabel Thorne are hereby dismissed. The prisoner is exonerated, her character restored the status of a loyal servant of the Crown and this estate." Isabel Thorne did not weep. She did not cry out in relief. She simply closed her eyes for a single second, the internal counting of her heart finally slowing to a calm, steady rhythm. She smoothed the silk of her bombazine skirts and stepped out of the dock, her movement as fluid and dignified as the day she had been arrested. She walked toward Arthur Sterling, the scent of the courtroom's stale air giving way to the faint, comforting aroma of lavender and old library leather that clung to his traveling cloak. "Arthur," she murmured, standing beside his wheelchair. She did not offer him a hand of weakness. She stood as his anchor. "The work is not yet finished, Isabel," the Duke replied, looking at his nephew. The aftermath of the trial was a scene of clinical, methodical justice. Silas Vane was not permitted to slink away into the shadows of his own ruin. As the gallery began to disperse, Justice Reginald Finch signaled to the bailiffs. The arrest of Silas Vane was not a matter of emotion, it was a matter of law. Isabel watched with a cold, analytical precision as the officers approached. She performed a silent inventory of Silas's physical decline, noting the subtle marks of his moral bankruptcy. There was a faint fraying at the edges of his lace cravat, the silk beginning to unravel like his schemes. The gold head of his cane, now lying on the floor, was tarnished in the crevices, the silver gilt wearing thin from the friction of nervous, sweaty palms. His boots, though polished to a mirror shine, bore the distinct, deep creases of excessive walking. The hallmark of a man who had lost his carriage to creditors and was forced to navigate the London mud on foot. Silas Vane was led away, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, the arrogance of the Sterling bloodline stripped from him like a discarded coat. He did not look like an heir. He looked like a common debtor whose accounts had finally come due. Behind him, Dr. Edmund Graves was led away in silence, his medical bag, once a tool of his trade, now a repository of the falsified charts and vials of sedative that would ensure his own professional and legal destruction. The handcuffs were not merely circlets of steel. They were the final entries in a ledger of social crime. The return to Ashbourne Manor was a procession of quiet, expansive peace. The carriage moved through the golden light of the late afternoon, the autumn leaves falling like copper coins upon the gravel path. The house, which had tasted of cold beeswax and funeral lilies only days before, now seemed to breathe with a new, invigorated discipline. Martha Higgins stood at the front doors, her apron white and stiff, her face glowing with a quiet, triumphant pride. The staff had lined the hall, a sea of straight spines and silent respect for the woman who had saved them all through the art of stewardship. Isabel entered the library ahead of the Duke, her mind immediately shifting from the drama of the courtroom to the cold reality of restoration. She paused in the center of the room, her eyes performing a calculated observation, a mental audit of the estate's heart. She counted the 412 volumes of records housed in the mahogany shelves, noting the exact 3mm layer of dust on the 1817 ledger, the volume that marked the beginning of Silas's systematic thefts. She measured the angle of the Duke's writing desk, noticing it had tilted 2 degrees toward the window, a result of a warped floorboard caused by a leak in the north roof that had gone untended during her imprisonment. She inspected the inkwells, dried and cracked, and the silver pen tray that was missing a single nib. For Isabel, this was not a room of literature, it was a battlefield of mismanagement. She did not feel overwhelmed. She felt a surge of cold, methodical purpose. She walked to the window and measured the slant of the light against the overgrown hedges of the west garden. The neglected grounds were not a sign of decay. They were a list of tasks that would be prioritized by the ticking of the clock. "The inventory is extensive, Arthur," Isabel said as the Duke was wheeled into the room. She did not fix her gaze on him. Her attention turned to the Ashbourne ledger lying on the desk. "The roof requires 400 new slates. The tenants in the valley have been overcharged by 12% to cover Silas's losses at the gaming tables. The steward's records for the past quarter are missing 3 entries regarding the coal shipments." Arthur Sterling smiled, a thin, tired expression of genuine respect. "They thought they gave you a ruin, Isabel. They thought they gave you a sentence of 20 years. But they were merely the tools of a restoration they could not understand. You are not my secretary. You are the architect of my survival." He gestured to the desk. "Bring the papers. The final audit begins now." Isabel did not call for an act of endowment this time. She called for a formal deed of trust and a declaration of guardianship. With the light of the fire catching the gold leaf on the book spines, Arthur Sterling signed the documents that would legally cement her authority. He officially named Isabel Thorne as his legal guardian and the primary trustee of the Ashbourne estate, granting her the power to manage the lands, the mines, and the finances without the interference of the vultures of his bloodline. Isabel watched the nib move across the parchment. She saw the broken A appear once more, the microscopic gap, the jagged stutter of the ink. It was no longer a secret mark of survival. It was a contract of mutual respect and shared truth. She felt the profound, cathartic satisfaction of being truly seen, not for the beauty she lacked, but for the mind and the labor she had dedicated to this house. The social invisibility that had once been her burden was now her greatest weapon of influence. "The ledger is in balance, Arthur," Isabel Thorne said, her voice level and poised. "The debts of the past are settled. The future of Ashbourne is recorded in the ink of our own making." She looked out the window at the thriving fields and the ancient oaks, no longer sentinels of a dying line, but guardians of a legacy restored. The house was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the long-case clock in the hall. It was a matter of action, not of emotion. It was a silent private art of survival that had culminated in a public triumph of dignity. Isabel Thorne closed the ledger, the sound of the heavy cover falling shut, a final, decisive note in the symphony of her vindication. She stood by the window, a plain woman in a dark dress, holding the keys to the most powerful house in the county, her heart finally at peace in the cold, clear light of justice. The architecture of her dignity was complete, and for the first time in her life, she was truly home.